So thank you very much, Keith Lockitch and Aaron Smith, fellows of the Ayn Rand Institute, for this amazing interview about a topic that I think it's interesting for everybody. And we're going to talk about how can there be a universe without a God, which is one of the main explanations that religious people give when you tell them that, you know, there's the possibility that their God is not real. And they say to you, well, but what about this perfect universe, this perfect earth, and this perfect life? So thank you very much for being here. And I want to start by defining what is universe.
Yeah, I think that's important to get on the table from the outset because it has significance for how you think about the universe in terms of can it have a cause, and so on. So the way we use the term universe, it refers to the sum total of existence. So basically, it's everything that exists thought of as a total or as a whole. So everything that exists is part of or an aspect of the universe. So the implication there is there's nothing outside the universe. There's something other than the universe. If something exists, it's part of what exists. It's part of the universe. That's important. So because often what people refer to when they think of the universe, right, they picture galaxies and they think very specifically of it's certain kind of physical objects or a set of physical objects. If you define it as everything that exists thought of as a sum, as a whole, then it will include anything that exists in terms, including consciousness, ideas, thoughts. I mean, just everything, all of the entities, including their properties and relationships.
So if everything that exists is part of the universe, it refers to everything that is natural. Everything that is part of the universe has a nature, to say like that. So there is no room for the supernatural or the anti-natural, which some religious people claim, right?
I mean, so the whole concept of the supernatural is something that's outside the natural order. It's something that is not part of the universe. It's outside of everything that exists and everything that sort of has an identity. I mean, one of Ayn Rand's perspectives in metaphysics, this is the perspective that we're talking about here, is that everything that exists has identity. It is what it is. It has a specific nature. And the whole idea of the supernatural is that things can violate their identity. They can be outside of the order of what is and be different from, the part of the idea of existence is that everything that exists is what it is. And the supernatural is a way to try to avoid that implication.
Yeah, and specifically, I think the notion of a God is essentially tied to it's a supernatural being. If you thought of God as something within the natural order, something like a planet or love or meaning or existence, you're essentially an atheist. So I think to be a theist is to accept the existence of a supernatural being, something that stands outside and is not subject to natural law, and more specifically toward the law of identity and the law of causality, because God is supposed to have attributes that have no identity. It's omniscient, it's omnipresent. Something can't be everywhere at the same time. What would its nature be for it to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, or to be omnipotent? To be able to literally be capable of absolutely anything is to possess no identity, is to possess no definite identity.
So how come if the definition of God includes all these supernatural, irrealistic powers, right? Omnipresent, omnipotent, all these things that violate the laws of nature and the laws of the universe as we know it, how come two concepts that are completely contradictory could be one the cause of the other? Where does this confusion come from? That two things that are completely opposite can be one the cause of the other. How can people say that without a God there cannot be a universe if the universe is everything that exists, and for God to exist it implies that it's outside of the existence of that universe?
I think the answer is that most people don't accept the absolutism of existence. They don't grasp what Ayn Rand considers an axiom: is existence exists. I mean, that is a fact. And there's no outside of existence. There's no before existence. There's nothing other than existence. The universe doesn't require an explanation. An explanation would be to cite some cause that stands outside of the universe, which somehow bears a relationship to the universe. There is no such thing. So it's to understand that existence is an absolute. It exists. It always has existed. There was no cause of existence. There can be no cause of existence. All causes are within the universe. There's no such thing as outside of the universe. So to grasp that existence is an absolute that does not require a cause, to grasp that, I mean, you have to grasp that. If you don't grasp that, then you'll constantly be asking your questions. Well, this coffee cup was created, maybe some factory in China or something, I don't know, right? But it had a cause. It wasn't always here. And then at some point, it got made, and there it is, here it is. And we tend to think of the universe in those same terms, like right. It's some entity that it wasn't there at some point, and then it came to be, and then, well, heck, it had to have a cause, right? You can't think of the universe in that same way. If the universe is that which exists, like existence doesn't have a cause, because the cause would have to exist. It would have to be part of existence. So there's nothing. Yeah.
And if you think about sort of historically, why do people come to this view that the universe has to have a cause, or everything has to have, all these things have to have this kind of supernatural cause? You have to remember that religion is a primitive form of philosophy. People need answers. They need a philosophical framework to understand where they are, their place in the world, in the universe, and what they should do with their life. And if you think about primitive man before science, before human knowledge really started to take off, they're surrounded by all these things that happen that they don't understand and they can't explain. And so the wind blows the tree, they see the trees shaking, and there must be wind gods, and there's river gods, and so the idea of coming up with these kinds of explanations, it's understandable at a stage in human history when people knew basically nothing. Right. But that's the origin, and the idea of extending that to everything has to have this kind of cause, and the universe has to have this kind of cause. So I think it's understandable that people would come to this view, even though it's wrong. And to hold that view today, after ancient Greek philosophy, after Aristotle's discoveries, and after the Enlightenment, I think is clinging to these sort of ancient primitive notions at a time when we have science and we have reason, and we should be abandoning them.
So where does the line stop? Because it is hard even for someone that is studying the evolution of the universe, right? From the Big Bang to the formation of planets and Earth, and then life on Earth, and how that life has been evolving in 5 massive extinctions. And we are, the most rational of all the different species that have, come of this process. And you get used to, even if you start studying science and the formation of the universe, to find cause and effect, way back to how is the cell formation and the evolution. How could we give people a clear key or mentality or map into understanding that even when you're studying science, where everything has a cause and an effect, and matter transforms and nothing just disappears, it only mutates to different stages, that does not mean that the universe per se needs to have a creator or a primary cause.
Yeah, and I think the thing to grasp there is that a supernatural explanation is a contradiction in terms.
Mm-hmm.
So if you try to explain the natural by reference to the unintelligible, it doesn't serve as an explanation. An explanation gives understanding. And because every time, so if you take seriously that God is a supernatural being, God is not subject to the laws of nature. He's not subject to the law of identity. He's not subject to the law of causality, which is why he's always invested with superpowers, so that he can make anything happen, even though it's impossible, right? That's the whole point of having a God. So if you take that seriously, you've placed God, what your explanation is, God, you've placed it outside human understanding. You've made it literally an unknowable being, an unintelligible being. And that cannot serve as an explanation for anything, because basically what it boils down to is your explanation is this: a magical being did it by magic. That's your explanation. And you can dignify it more and say a supernatural being did it by supernatural means. But that just means an unknowable being did it by unknowable means. That's my explanation. And that's really what it amounts to. And to place that on a par by dignifying that with the term explanation, and to place that on a par with what goes on in science, is ludicrous. I mean, science provides causal explanations. It identifies some known fact, establishes a causal relationship between that known fact and something that was previously unknown.
Right.
That is how human knowledge progresses. By tying it, say, well, how did this happen? How did this come about? What's the explanation? A magical being did it by magic. An unintelligible being did it by unintelligible means. Like, that is not an explanation, and it never can be.
But how can you explain to people that although there is a cause and an effect in this universe, that doesn't mean that there is a cause for the universe?
Well, ask them this question. Well, I've been speaking, but ask them this question. So what did they postulate as an alleged cause of existence?
Mm-hmm.
Something that exists or something that doesn't exist?
Yeah,
Right.
the question, why is there something rather than nothing, which some people think is a profound question, is actually a completely silly question, because there is no alternative to existence. Existence exists, and there is no such thing as nothingness. There is no nothing. There's only that which exists. So the idea that everything that we study in science, the things in the world, the causes that give rise to them, those we can seek explanations for, because they, what we're trying to get at is, what is the identity of the things that exist, and what actions are possible to them given their identity. That's something we can study. But the question of why does existence exist at all is not even a legitimate question.
Because the implication is there's something other than existence that exists that would then cause existence to exist. It's an incoherent question, although it's tricky because it seems like it is coherent. And so I want to go back to something Keith said. He was talking about religion as a primitive form of philosophy, and it's a primitive form of explanation, and that's true. But there's also a sense in which this is the development every one of us has to go through, whether we're in caveman time or we're today. So because you have to come to grasp that this cell phone came into existence, this shirt came into existence, I wasn't always exist. So when you look around, it seems like stuff comes into and goes out of existence. Things come to be and pass away. And it seems like the same kind of legitimate question. Where did the cup come from? Did Aaron always exist? No. Right. And to then transfer that same form of question to the universe. But you have to come to grasp that that is actually incoherent. It's an irrational question, but not crazy. It's just you're applying one form of question which is legitimate in most aspects of existence, but not it. You have to come to grasp that it is not legitimate to ask about existence, because any proposed answer would have to be something that exists separate from existence, and there's no such thing.
That's actually a brilliant explanation, that we are all our own Big Bang, right? We're born and we start a new existence that was not part of the universe for 14 billion years until we start existing. And if we think of that with everything that exists and starts being part of this life, then we can extrapolate that explanation to the universe as well. And let's talk about that, because a lot of people say, well, look how perfect this design is. Let's say that we still don't have an explanation for why the universe exists, but we will come to that later, I don't know, in thousands of years. But for the moment, just look around. Look how perfect this design is. The moon does not fall into the earth. In the earth, there's life because there's the sun and everything that exists, all the animals, us, we're so perfect. We are designed in this magnificent way, and the human body is such a brilliant machine. How come you're talking about something that was not designed by this supernatural mind? So let's talk a little bit about life on Earth and the perfection of the design of the universe.
Yeah, so it gets back to what I was saying earlier, which is what we observe is that everything in the universe is orderly, and it seems to follow natural laws. There's sort of lawfulness. It's not just sort of this chaos. But where does that order come from? It comes from the fact that everything that exists has an identity. So it's the law of identity is what gives rise to give rise to the orderliness of nature and the laws of nature. But the thing is that if we can really be amazed when we study science and we understand how it is that all these things, all the causes that give rise to the order that we see, what we really should be amazed about is the power of reason to penetrate into an understanding of nature. You know, in the ancient times, they didn't understand why the moon doesn't fall into the earth. They didn't understand, the perfection of the solar system. They didn't, prior to Darwin, we didn't have a really good explanation for how life progresses and the origin of species and all that sort of thing. But once we know those things, it's a testament to the power of reason and to our ability to develop scientific understanding that we can be amazed at how wonderful all this is.
Yeah, and I'll say a couple of things to add to that. One, there's no perfection in nature. There's no such thing. So the perfection means it meets some sort of ideal standard or some particular standard that it measures up to, and some things don't measure up to it. But there is no such standard when you're talking about nature. Like, is space dust perfect? I don't know. By what standard? Like, who would set the standard? What would the standard be? Like, what would be an imperfect piece of, I don't know, with that, it doesn't even have any meaning with regard to the universe. The other thing is to say, so I'll tell you, I personally am extremely impressed by nature. And I don't know if impressed is quite the word, but amazed by, and I think what grabs people's attention and what is they find plausible to think of, there has to be a designer, is the intricacy and the complexity of the fittedness to purpose in nature. So when you look at the structure of the eye or the relationship of the nerves to the brain and just how all these things work, it's stunning. And then people think, well, it's kind of like an iPhone. Okay, this is Samsung, but it's kind of like a phone, right? You break it apart and you find out the complexity and interrelationships that make it do and function as it does. I think that's what impresses people. And it should impress them. That's amazing. And yet, if you're looking for an answer to why are things that way, what caused them to be that way, you either can go the route of science, which means the route of knowledge and understanding, or you can go supernatural and forever be without any understanding at all. Because what you appeal to is a magic being designed it by magical means, which are unknowable to us. And again, there's no explanation there at all. But so the means of understanding it is just like science, and we progressively are explaining more and more and more and more about why things are the way they are.
We know more about the universe today that we have never done before, and we have had different times in human existence where we have tried to approach that knowledge, like, for example, with the Alexandria Library and the burn of the Alexandria Library, and then it's 1,000 years of dark ages, right? So there has been like a push and pull of these two forces on how to explain the universe, either supernatural or through science. And we are in the most scientific time of all of humanity, and yet there are people denying all the lessons of science. And I think it's also because they tell you, well, there is no way to prove evolution. You also believe in evolution by faith, but you cannot go back and observe everything that happened, and there's a lot of missing links within the evolution. And they say to you, so even if you believe in evolution, you are doing it so by an act of faith, because you don't have metaphysical proof that evolution and this fittingness to purpose, as Aaron just described, happened the way it did when it could happen some other way. What would you answer to that?
So let's define our terms again here. So what is meant by faith? Faith means believing in something in the absence of evidence or in defiance of the need for evidence. Believing it just because, right?
Yeah.
That's the opposite of science and scientific explanation, where any conclusion that one comes to is the result of reasoning from evidence, from observations, from facts, from evidence. Now, the idea that you have to, in order to prove evolution, you have to have been able to go back in time and watch species evolve, that completely misunderstands how science works, what kind of evidence you can rely on. I mean, there's geological evidence, fossil evidence going back millions of years it's this large inductive integration that draws on thousands of different facts and pieces of evidence that you can pull together to reach the conclusion that evolution is the explanation for the origin of species and the development of life on Earth. There's no faith involved in that at all, because you're not believing it in defiance of evidence or regardless of evidence. You're believing it based on the evidence.
And is the objection that, I find this to be a bogus objection, in the sense that, so what can the religious people do? They have to go back in time and watch God create the universe and then say, hey, we got the facts and you guys don't. I mean, they don't, nobody believes that. Not even the most religious person you can imagine. Nobody thinks that that's what would account as establishing something as truth. But is the objection supposed to be that people that accept a scientific perspective on the development of species and things like that, they have to rely on faith, but then the religious person has to rely on faith, so we're on equal terms? I mean, if it's more of that, then you'd have to actually establish that what's going on in science or whatever is faith. And I think Keith is completely right, is that if you actually look at how scientists function and how they collect evidence and reach theories, you can make mistakes, but this is not remotely the same as faith. It's a bogus objection in the end, I think.
So let's talk about chaos, because a lot of people say that the universe is not chaotic. And in part of that design, there is no chaos. But when you actually, as you say, you observe what scientists are doing and how they understand the universe, there's chaos everywhere. And maybe planet Earth is the product of where chaos happening around has a specific situations and circumstances that allowed for life to develop on Earth and not, let's say, in Mars, in Jupiter, in Venus, etc. And now we know that we're not even the center of the universe. We're part, as a pale blue dot, like Carl Sagan said, in a remote galaxy, in the corners of that galaxy, where there are other millions of galaxies, and the probability of other lives that maybe don't even respond to DNA. They can respond to other codes of fittingness to purpose and development of life could also happen. But is this a product of chaos or a product of order, like some people like to believe?
Well, you'd have to define chaos. So if what you mean by chaos is that at some level, at some quantum level, more than one outcome can result from a given state of affairs, and we can't really predict it, like what's going to happen or where some particle is going to be or whatever. If you think of that, sometimes people refer to that as randomness. But if that's all you mean, I don't think there's any kind of contradiction there. There are things that we're unable to predict and to explain currently. But if by chaos you mean things happening in contradiction to their identity, this coffee cup turns into Friedrich Hegel, and Keith becomes a butterfly. These things are simply not possible.
Right.
So every entity has a specific identity, a specific set of properties, and can function only in the confines of those properties. A thing can only do what it has the capacity to do or to become. And so in that sense, there's no such thing as chaos. If you mean some non-causal, contra-causal sort of events, there's no such thing. Now, so that's why you'd have to define, if you say there's chaos in the universe, you'd have to define what is actually you mean by chaos. And do you have a rational concept there that's actually applicable to a real phenomenon in the universe? Or are you talking about something non-causal, in which case, from objectivism's perspective, there simply is no such thing?
Yeah, and the whole pale blue dot idea, I think some people initially ancient men thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. We eventually learned that we're a planet that orbits around the sun, and then we learned that we're part of the Milky Way, and then we learned that the Milky Way is part of this local cluster. It's a small, like you said, and I think the implication that people draw from that is, oh, we thought we were so great, and now we realize we're just this tiny speck of dust. But again, I come back to a point that I made earlier, which is that what I take from that is a sense of awe at the human ability to come to learn all of that and to discover, here we are sitting on this speck of dust in this, enormous, vast cosmos. And yet we can understand that that's where we are. We can figure, if you think about, I'm actually going to be teaching a course starting in the fall through Ayn Rand University, if anyone's interested, on the foundations of physical science. And what we're going to do is we're going to trace, we're going to look at the observations that you make, in ancient astronomy. Like, here we are sitting on the Earth. If you actually look up in the sky and you look around, you see these things moving through the sky. How do you get from those observations to understanding all those things that you described, Gloria? How do we get to the stage of understanding that there's a solar system, and that there's a galaxy, there's a Milky Way galaxy, and that all these clusters of galaxies and all that? I instead of feeling small and insignificant, what I feel as a result of that is, what an amazing achievement is possible to the human mind.
Yeah, there's no diminishment of man's significance to find out that you're not at the center of the cosmos or something like that. That's to find that you're not in some uniquely positioned area ordained by God.
I agree. I think it's not a diminishment of us and our rational capacities, but maybe a diminishment in the beliefs, in the religious beliefs that we come to explain the rest of the universe, like if we were the center of it, right? But yes, sadly, that argument has not been taken in that sense. And I think that also another thing that puzzles people is, well, but there's reason, right? Without human reason, nothing of the things that we know about the universe could be explained and shared, right? It is like we are the only one species, as far as we know, in the universe with the capacity to explain the universe itself for us, not for anything else, but for us. So it seems like we are the cause and we are the purpose of explaining that universe. And in that sense, some people also find religious explanations for it, right? Because they say to you, well, look at the human mind. Where did reason come from? It has to come from a design, let alone the rest of the things that exist. But just as human beings and the capacity of reasoning, where did that come from? And why did it develop? And it seems to me that the why did reason develop becomes a question very similar to why did the universe came to existence? Maybe something that we cannot explain?
Well, the universe didn't come into existence. So there's no such thing. There's no intelligible way to even think about that. So if you're thinking about the cause of existence, you actually have no thought. There is actually no content to that thought. And there's no way to have any content to that thought. All you can do is imaginatively project something that from pieces of things that you do know exist and project it out into some non-world. It's fantasy, literally. There's no content to it. So we need to get away from thinking about, well, maybe there's a cause to these journeys, but we don't know what it is. It's literally unintelligible. And
the idea that reason, I mean, you were describing, how amazing reason is that allows us to understand all these things, and then you made a big leap to saying this, so therefore that must be the cause or the purpose of life or the purpose of existence, and that we were created for a purpose, but that's a pretty big leap. The fact that organisms exist and that have a certain type of consciousness that's a more powerful type of consciousness than the other animals, that doesn't there's no implication from that the ability to reason and the culmination of life in creatures that have the ability to reason somehow is the purpose of it all. It's completely natural to think that if you look at animal behavior, consciousness makes it possible for them to survive better. Animals that have clearer eyesight can see their prey at a greater distance, and that's a survival advantage. And there's all kinds of different ways in which different forms of consciousness provide a survival advantage. So over the course of human evolutionary history, the fact that our brains got bigger and bigger and allowed for more complex activities, the fact that resulted in a species that has the capacity to form concepts and to reason, it's completely natural. It's completely natural to see that as the result of an evolutionary process.
So could there be sorry, Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, and two things. I mean, objectivism, Ayn Rand's philosophy regards consciousness as a biological phenomenon. So it's not a soul, like a supernatural element or endowment. So it's a feature that certain living organisms possess as a result of complex organization. So it's not something mystical or spooky. But you have to take facts as facts. You have the ability to think, you have the ability to reason, and you can't make up explanations for that. So you have to study it, but that's a scientific question. So as Keith was saying, there are evolutionary reasons why consciousness affords us a survival advantage by making us aware of our surroundings and even aware of our awareness for us, so you can self-regulate and so on. So, but that's a scientific question. Why is there a reason? You have to study nature to figure out that. You don't, if you search for some theological answer, you've got a magic being did it by magic. You're back to non-explanation, unintelligibility.
But if we understand that consciousness comes in scales, there are levels of consciousness, from the consciousness or the lack of consciousness of a mosquito to the one of a pig, of a cow, of a dolphin, of a dog, of a human being. And that consciousness, the capacity of reason, has only been, developed in the human species. But if we could develop reason because of consciousness, other life forms could also do it. It would mean just a matter of time and evolution, right? What made the human species develop reason when we were not the strongest or the fittest or the fastest? We don't even have the best senses. There are animals that have better eyesight than us, better predatory skills, better senses of hearing, of smelling, but we were the ones who developed reason, and other animals have not yet developed reason. Could they?
But that's what Aaron was saying, is why did that happen? That's a scientific question. That's for evolutionary biologists to try to answer, and whether other species could. I mean, again, I don't think
philosophy doesn't have an answer to that.
Yeah, Yeah.
Except if they have the capability to do it given the causal factors, then they have the capability to do it given the causal factors. I think what's motivating the question is, we're special. Something had to make us special.
Right.
What was it? We're not special metaphysically.
Right.
So we're just the causal results. What our nature, what human nature is simply the result of all the regular, plain old garden variety causal forces that exist in the world. And we're special in a certain respect, in that we possess a capacity other beings do not seem to possess. And it affords us an ability that they don't, those other things do not possess, or do not possess anywhere in the degree that we do. So it's special from some perspective, but there's nothing metaphysically special about human beings. We're not this special, almost supernatural thing that somehow has been implanted into the world, and then you got to find, well, there has to be some sort of correlate, some sort of special supernatural cause that endowed nature with this amazing thing that's just nowhere else. And I don't think that there's a mistaken premise in that way of looking at the world.
Right. So the capacity of other species into developing reason could happen. It could.
Well, if it's possible, it's possible.
Right.
And if it's not, it's not. That's
if it was possible for us, it might be that it is possible. I don't know, maybe for species that are similar to us, but it would take millions of years and different things happening in the universe. And yet, because it is a process that takes such a long time and people need like quick explanations while they're alive, I think it's one of the reasons why they go for religious explanations into what's going on in the universe. And I think that your answers have been doing a pretty good job at explaining the metaphysical understandings of the universe and life in itself so far, to at least ignite in the audiences more and more questions, right? Because I think that this interview and its purpose is just to offer these explanations that can be the starting point to start thinking of things in different ways. So yes. I want to end with another question that is also part of the metaphysical, and it's the possibility of some scientists discussing about multiverses, right? Because we already discussed that there's this metaphysics, existence exists. The things that exist in this reality can only develop within the capacities that are in itself. You know, like Keith cannot become a butterfly. I'll never forget that one. But now let's talk about the possibility of not having only one metaphysical universe, the one that we know right now, but other universes. How does that come into play? Do you put it in the category of, you know, the supernatural nonsense that is, you know, just not proven? Is there some scientific basis as the probability of another species developing reason in the universe and the probability of that? How do you tackle the possibility of multiverses?
Well, if we go back to, so at the very beginning, the way we're defining the universe is it's everything that exists. So just on that basis alone, the idea that there's more than one doesn't make any sense. So the idea of another universe is sort of a self-contradiction. The universe is everything that exists. Now, if there in some astrophysical sense, if there are, you know, different regions of the universe through a wormhole or something like that, you know, the idea would be that would be part of the universe. It would just be some other part of it that is accessible through some different thing. Now, the idea if there's the idea of something that exists that's completely inaccessible, unknowable to anyone within the known universe, that's also a contradiction in terms. The idea that there's some alternate reality that exists but is completely cut off from us and is completely unknowable to us, that's a contradiction in terms, because how could you have any knowledge of it? How, I mean, just on the face of it, Now, there are, I mean, in physics, there are theories that people kick around for multiverses and all this sort of thing. And I think the motive for that is trying to explain certain phenomena that you see. And is this mathematical theory something that helps with that? So I'm not going to comment on that here, but on whether those theories make sense or whether they're plausible. But just on the face of it, given the idea of the universe as being the sum total of everything that exists, the idea that there's multiple universes doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and this is why it's important for people, not just. So I'm a philosopher. Keith's background is physics, but it's important to have a philosophic perspective on these kinds of questions, and not just a perspective on the questions, but a perspective on the proper methodology for addressing these questions. So just take the point I made about the nature of explanation. That's a philosophic question. That's not a physics question. It's not a chemistry question. It's not a history question. It's a philosophy question. But it helps you think better and more clearly and more rationally about even the questions you're answering. So Keith mentioned the Ayn Rand University. Both of us are on the faculty there. And it's the best place where you can come to study objectivism or Ayn Rand's philosophy. And we do, part of what we do in there is to teach people to think better, more clearly, more rationally, but not just about the topics and the issues covered, like the kinds of things we're talking about today. This is what has helped us think a lot more clearly about these issues, like in our own time. But to help you think more generally, think more clearly about all sorts of things, not just God or something, or physics questions.
What about the possibility of not the multiverse, but in this same universe, a place or places where the laws of physics don't apply? That would also be a contradiction in its terms, right? Because some people say, okay, maybe not multiverses, but maybe inside of this universe, not everything behaves the way it does on Earth. But
I think that if you discovered some aspect of the universe which could not be understood in terms of the laws of physics as they're currently understood, you would need to account for that phenomenon by either revising the laws or contextualizing their application. But what you would not find is some area of the universe where things don't function in terms of their identity, and things are outside causality. In other words, their actions bear no relationship to their identity. That you will not find that.
Yeah, it gets back to the idea that we've been arguing, that the laws of physics or the laws of nature are simply a consequence of the law of identity, that everything that exists is what it is. It has a nature and it acts in accordance with its nature. So if there are different things in the universe that we haven't discovered yet that don't act according to the laws of nature that we know about, then as Aaron says, we'd have to update, we'd have to expand our understanding, have to expand the laws of nature, expand our understanding of what's physically possible. But that wouldn't be a violation of the laws of physics. It would be new things that we have to study and understand.
And an expansion of our knowledge of what's possible in the universe. I find that exciting. I think it'd be neat if you discovered something like that. So, there's something we don't know, something we then have to reintegrate, and that could lead to further growth in knowledge.
I mean, that's been the history of science.
That is the history.
Things that we didn't understand before, and then we had to account for them with our understanding of the laws of nature. That's what the growth of our understanding of science has been for 2,000 years. So
yeah. No, and I think that this conversation is also very transforming. I was reading that in a book of Steven Pinker, that 1 in every 4 Americans deny existence as it is because they deny evolution. I cannot even imagine in Latin America, like the topics that we have discussed in the past 40 minutes, for most of people are just not the way that things are. So talking about this is so useful for the minorities in some parts of the world that do appreciate the scientific capacity of finding answers, the capability of reason as the most important tool for human life. And I think that the more and more we talk about Ayn Rand's philosophy and objectivism, which is a philosophy that is based precisely in the fact that existence exists instead of denying it, the more we can do for enlightening people about how to live a rational life. And I want to thank you both for these amazing answers. And I think that when we post this with the Spanish subtitles and we share it with the Latin American audiences, there's going to be a lot of controversy, but I hope that it's a good controversy. And I want to wrap up for everything that we say, asking you these direct questions with answers for everybody that is listening and they are still like, wait, but then how do I think about these issues, right? So the first one is, do we need a God for the existence of the universe?
No. No, for all the reasons we've given.
Do we need a God to understand life, intelligence, love, earthquakes, and mountains?
God makes the understanding of those things impossible.
Do we need a God to know and understand what is right and what is wrong?
Same answer. It affords no explanation at all.
That's a whole separate question about where does morality come from. We can have another discussion about it at some point.
We will definitely have another discussion. Just to cover how existence exists is so controversial enough that we will definitely have another conversation on that one. Do we need a God for anything at all? Like if it's not good to explain the universe or to explain life on Earth or to explain why do we have reason?
The only thing we need a God for is to make the Marvel films more interesting. You need Thor as part of the cast in order to make the films as good as they are. That's all you need a God for.
I think if what you want is to maintain the possibility that things that are impossible can happen, you need a God. Right.
Can you offer a final thought on or advice to young people who are trying to find answers to these complicated questions?
Yeah, for somebody who grows up with religion, it's in your community, you get it from your parents, you get it from your religious leaders. It's completely understandable to hold these views and to take it for granted that God exists and explains all these things. And it can be very difficult to challenge those ideas. But what I would encourage you to do if you're someone in this position is take your own mind and your own understanding, your own firsthand understanding of things seriously, and take seriously the idea that explanations of things have to make sense. And you can't just cling to things because this is what you're told by your parents or your community. If anything that we've said here is causes you to question or challenge these ideas, take that seriously and pursue them, because you'll find that, it can have a huge impact on your life to take reason seriously and to question these things that you've been brought up with.
And people are very connected, and they find meaning and connection and stuff with their religious views. But a rational perspective on life is not abandoning meaning. It's not abandoning purpose. It's embracing a better alternative. It's pulling you into the field of reality, reason, purpose, self-esteem, achievement, knowledge. It's an upgrade. It's not, I abandoned something and now I have a bleak perspective on the universe. I'm floating on a blue dot and nothing means anything. No, it's the opposite. Or
be the worst version of yourself, because there's not a God who's going to come to punish you. Yeah.
Yeah, and the implication there was that if there wasn't a God, I'd just run rampant and just trample over other people. Well, maybe that person would. I wouldn't. But to figure out why, and that goes to the ethics thing, you have to have a rational perspective on morality, and to think of it as it's in terms of trying to identify the values and the methods that actually support, sustain, and enhance human life. And that's what morality is about, not compliance to a divine regulator.
And now that we have established that existence exists and not because of a God, thanks to Keith and Aaron, on the next episode, we will discover, well, now what, right? Existence exists, there's no God, now what? Now, what do I do with my life? Is there a place for morality in that kind of life? But thank you very much for this interview, Aaron and Keith, and to all of you for being with us. Remember that you can find more information on all these topics and also on ethics in the Ayn Rand Institute and the Ayn Rand University, where Keith and Aaron are giving courses. So thank you very much. Until next time.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Gloria.